All right, let's get started. I'm very honored to be here to welcome Laura Murphy back to Cornell, back to Ithaca, and to say two words of introduction. My name is Magnus Fiskesjö. I'm an anthropology professor here. I have been following closely the events in China's Uyghur region for the last few years, and including following closely the output from Laura, who's published many relevant reports. She is originally from Louisiana, USA, and she has a PhD in African studies. In recent years, she's been working on forced labor around the world, in Africa, in Asia, and in other places. She is a professor of human rights and contemporary slavery at the Helena Kennedy Center for International Justice at Sheffield, Hallam University in the UK. You're nodding, it's correct. Yes, I got it, yes. So because of her expertise on the issue of forced labor products from China, and in the light of the challenges enforcing the US law, that law that's entitled Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, adopted by the US Congress a couple years ago. She has been invited and is currently serving as policy advisor to the US government in the Department of Homeland Security, investigating forced labor trade with reference to this act and to the work related to preventing forced labor products from entering the US. And that's what you see in the title of her talk today, Fighting Uyghur Forced Labor, how government, researchers, industry, and civil society collaborate to protect consumers from products made with forced labor. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Laura, and let's give her a round of applause to welcome her to Cornell. Thank you.
Thank you.
You don't need this?
I have my own.
Yeah, good.
Yeah. Is it working? We're good? Yeah, sounds good. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you, Magnus, for inviting me, and thank you to all the folks who worked so hard to organize this event. I always give myself a slide. Oops. Yeah, a slide that says gratitude, so I don't forget to thank all the people who put these kinds of things together. Y'all's itineraries are really thorough and helpful. Thank you so much. I've been following it every day. I have a picture of it. I'm making sure I'm doing every single thing on time, being in the right place. Thank you so much. I know it takes a lot of work to put these things together and to be thoughtful and to have water and all of this, and so I'm really grateful to you all for having me. And thank you all for coming. Today, as Magnus said, I am not a China scholar. I was trained as an Africanist. I've been working on forced labor since the beginning of my PhD, and I've had this kind of interesting and strange journey to the place where I am now. I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A if you want. But one thing I should note is that I'm only recently a government employee. I'm an academic by training and profession and calling. And I'm used to talking as an academic in front of audiences like this. I am not accustomed to speaking on behalf of the US government in spaces like this. So if you see me stopping for a second and thinking, I'm usually just bold as love and say whatever I think, but knowing you can see the emblem up here, you know that I can't say everything I normally would as an academic. What I want to do today is kind of give us a sense of where we've come in terms of the research that has fed a movement to fight forced labor in the Uyghur region, and that is the grounding and the basis upon which the US government acts on this. And that comes from my academic research. And then I'll also talk about what I see as sort of the primary movers and kind of challenges, actually, that we face now that I'm in the U.S. government. And then we'll have a Q&A where we'll turn off the cameras and we'll sit and be frank and talk to each other. I'll still be representing the U.S. government, so there's that. But you know, we can all talk and we can ask questions. And so please do keep those, and we'll talk more afterwards. So I assume that most of you here are here in part because you already know something about what's going on in the Uyghur region, also called East Turkestan by the people who are from there. It is a settler colony in what China considers its borders. China has systematically sent people out to colonize that region. The PRC government has for a few generations now, but increasingly in the last 10 years. Significant efforts to send Han Chinese people out to conduct what is called population optimization by the PRC government, to optimize the population of the region, to diminish the population of Uyghurs proportionally, to spread out and distribute those populations, and to sinicize those populations. As part of that work, that program, the Chinese government has, as you know, I'm sure, set up internment camps all over the region, and at their height, people said there was that measurements or estimates suggested there was between 1 million and 1.8 million people interned in those camps. Upwards of 3 million people have been transferred annually to jobs in factories, and that constitute forced labor under any definition you can find under international law. And that experts all agree constitutes forced labor. That forced labor, this is what I study, happens through several different mechanisms. One of them is prison and internment camp labor. You saw probably in 2019 and 2020 increasing evidence of factories inside the walls of those internment camps. And we have documented propaganda from the Chinese government that shows how supposedly happy people were to be working at the factories, and how they were learning vocational skills as part of their transformation to productive members of society. This was the propaganda that we received, and so we were able to see what was actually happening, because the Chinese government and the corporations and the internment camp officials were wanting the Chinese population to know that they were transforming the Uyghur people into the kinds of citizens the government wanted. There was also a moment when, as people were being released, they were told, okay, you can be released from the camps, but you'll have to go into a factory. There are also programs where where companies have built satellite factories in small villages so that there's a factory at your doorstep. So people aren't transferred, but they're compelled to go work at a factory in their neighborhood. And then there are the transfers. That's largely the subject of my research, where people are encouraged and then compelled by the state, if they decline, to go and to be transferred to a factory outside of their town, or even outside of the region itself, far from there, some thousands of miles away sometimes from their hometowns, where the government says, hey, look, you are, and I'm going to talk about how this works in a minute, but you are someone we want to have go work in a factory. You don't really have a choice. Of course, maybe you have children. We'll take care of that. We'll liberate you from your children by putting your children in residential schools. Oh, maybe you've got grandparents to take care of. Don't worry about that. We've built elder care facilities. Oh, you worried about your land? Don't worry. We're going to cooperativize your land, and we'll give you a small dividend, and we'll liberate you from your land, unburden you so that you're liberated to go and work. And so people are then compelled to go and be transferred. We have identified directives that come straight from the central government, but also local governments, that say that resisting a government program like this is considered tantamount to a terrorist act, or to be one of the signs of terrorism. There are also documents that say that the consequence for refusing a program like this is lawful detention. So we know that people cannot refuse. And in that environment, what we consider as experts of forced labor, if you have no meaningful way to resist or refuse your consent, that is a situation where you lack consent, and therefore we consider that forced labor, right? Even though some people, like, look, I grew up in a tiny town in Louisiana. I didn't grow up in New Orleans. I grew up in a tiny town where my entire life, all I wanted to do was get out, right? And if someone had come knocked on my door at 16 years old and said, hey, there's a factory job, in a big city in the United States, I would have been like, yeah, okay, I'll do that. Right? Whatever it takes to get to a big city, to get out of my small town, to get out of my impoverished life, yes. There are probably some people, some Uyghurs, and there always have been some Uyghur people who choose to go and work in a factory in Guangdong or something like that, right? But what we know now is that in the case of the Uyghur people, and this is different from other kinds of poverty alleviation and labor transfer programs in the rest of China, is that when a person comes to a Uyghur or a representative of a company or a representative of the police or your government or the Social Security Bureau comes to a Uyghur person and says, hey, there's this opportunity to go and work at a factory in Guangdong, they can say yes, they might say yes, but they cannot say no. And that's what constitutes forced labor. That's why all of the scholars I know who work on forced labor were immediately, red flags immediately when we started to see what was happening in the Uyghur region. A quick update, because what I just told you is what you probably already know if you've been following this. Based on, I have brackets because that number is completely wrong. That number is actually 90,000. So this number right here is wrong. That number, well, that didn't help you. So let me go through them and I'll correct bullet point 3 in a second. That number should be 90,000. So what we know is that there are some camps that have closed. It's true. We can see it from satellite imagery. We can see people have been on the ground, news reporters. Some folks from Sky News, for instance, have been on the ground. Folks from different government agencies have been on the ground and seen that some camps have closed. It's true. Not all camps, some camps. But what we know is that the system of mass arbitrary detention continues. The Chinese government has imprisoned record numbers of Uyghur people, far, far beyond what any other province is experiencing. And those sentences are often for things that are not, in fact, crimes, even under Chinese law. So people are being sentenced to very long prison sentences for things that are not crimes. And in a way, that use of the word prison, use of the word imprisoned, lends a certain legitimacy, right? Because countries all over the world have prisons. They put people in prisons for breaking laws. But we have to remember that this legitimacy, that when we call it a prison, it kind of carries with it the idea that there is a judicial process, that there is rule of law that's binding there, that people are being imprisoned for things that are actually crimes. And in these cases, we're not talking about that. We're talking about extrajudicial sentencing of people with the guise of legitimacy of the prison, if you even want to accept that prisons are legitimate. But again, that is not the government speaking, that is me. But if we accept that prisons have legitimacy, this is not that, right? And we also are seeing that there are, and this is bullet point 3 where the number should be corrected to 90,000. There are 90,000 people being held in pretrial detention centers where they're supposed to be let out within 90 days but have been held for years. And some of the worst stories of abuse and torture come from that Conchosois system. And so this is something we need to be concerned about as well. It's part of this mass arbitrary detention. This is a part of the judicial system that is being abused and people are being held there without sentencing or without charges. And so we need to think of this as part of the mass arbitrary detention. We're also seeing upwards of 1 million children in residential schools. Actually, Professor Fiscesio has done some really good work on this. There's some new work coming out on this as well, confirming the numbers that he's stated. And those residential schools are non-voluntary residential schools. Often parents are gone, they don't have the ability to consent, and the children are sent to boarding schools. There's actually a directive indicating that all middle school children, 100% of middle school children in the Uyghur region should be in residential schools. And so, and again, this may outpace the boarding school numbers in the rest of China, but in the rest of China, there isn't this compulsory element of it. And the thing to remember is that in 2013, there were practically no boarding schools for Uyghur youth in the Uyghur region. And now it's exploded under these directives where people are supposed to be 100% of middle school students should be in the residential schools. And so it shows you the idea that Uyghur folks didn't originally voluntarily send their kids, or 10 years ago, send their kids to residential schools, but now they're being compelled to. And this is part of the systematic erasure of Uyghur culture and separation of families from their children. And there's a normalization of stability measures that is meant to make us all feel calmer about what's going on there. Everything has been under control. The media says, okay, there's not been a terrorist act in 5 years. We're normalizing our stability measures. Everything's okay. Everybody calm down, right? Let's stop yelling about this. It's going to be fine. But I think that we should think of this as the normalization of the genocide. And I think we need to think of forced labor as the fulcrum through which the genocide is operating now. So we paid a lot of attention to the internment camps, and that really struck a nerve globally, really got people activated and motivated to think about what can we do to help the Uyghurs. As the internment camp system is transformed into this other form of mass arbitrary detention, and more people are moved into forced labor, people are starting to think maybe we can let up a little. But in fact, I argue that the forced labor system is the means by which they're able to say, okay, you need to all be moving out of your town and be dispersed so that the population is optimized. It also separates people by gender, male and female. It also separates people from their children. It's forced migration. These are all the hallmarks of genocide, by the definition of genocide. It's not mass extermination. It's these forced migration, forced family separation, cultural erasure. These things are still happening, and forced labor mechanisms facilitate it. And so it's my argument and my job to think about how do we address that. And I want to talk about that today. And I'll just say quickly that this is facilitated by a kind of very deliberate calculus on the ground in the Uyghur region. There's a really rapid mechanization of farming in the region, and most people in southern Xinjiang are, and sorry, I keep saying Xinjiang because in the government we use political names, but East Turkestan, the Uyghur region. In East Turkestan, there's a rapid mechanization of farming, which means that farmers are unemployed, right? And then at the same time, there's a co-optation of their land into these cooperatives. The state comes in and says, we'd like to cooperativize your land. We want you to be able to facilitate large-scale farming. And so we want to be able to move in these mechanized methods of farming. Your methods are backwards. They're not really contributing to the larger economy. You're, not, this isn't a stable way of us conducting farming in this region, so we're gonna mechanize it. We're gonna cooperativize your land. You're all gonna be unemployed, but lo and behold, we're also moving a bunch of manufacturing out to the region, and we desperately need people to work in those factories, so bingo, we've made you unemployed. And now, lucky for you, we've got this labor transfer all lined up for you to move into a factory. And so all of this kind of plays together to create a vulnerability of the Uyghur people to where consent is manufactured. If you're unemployed and you're having to figure out what you're going to do with yourself, how you're going to feed your kids, well, we've got a factory job for you. And the way we know that Uyghur people don't want to take these jobs is because the state media keeps publishing articles in which people explicitly say, I don't want to go, and they're forced to go. And that's happening less and less. Increasingly, information is diminishing. You know what I mean? Increasingly, we're finding that it's harder to find this information. But oftentimes people, and I've got another slide in a minute, but oftentimes when we're looking up research about companies, we find that they'll say, we are doing a good job of transforming Uyghur minds because when they came here, they refused the transfer. They cried every night. They wanted to go home. They explicitly refused to come, but now they're happy here. And so we know that the process is working, the transformation is working. And so we can find, or we used to be able to find much more, people explicitly refusing it and still nonetheless being forced to go and take the transfers. And this is happening in industries that span all kinds of things. Most people know about cotton. 25% of the world's cotton is grown in the Uyghur region. Many people know that tomatoes, most of our tomato paste in the world comes from the Uyghur region. But a lot of other things people don't know. 10% of the world's aluminum is made in the Uyghur region. 10% of the world's PVC is made in the Uyghur region. It goes into this weird flooring that we're all sitting on, standing on. The fake wood, the plastic carpet goes into that. Critical minerals, mining, processing, and product manufacture, all moving rapidly out to the Uyghur region. Lithium and lithium-ion battery manufacturing, expanding at a clip that we couldn't even keep up with. Like, companies are registering by the minute in the Uyghur region, all with incentives from the Chinese government to move out to that region, because there, and I'm kind of preempting my next point, but there, people are considered to be disposable, and so is the land. So if you have a dirty process, you want to do something that's going to create a Superfund site, we got the place for you, right? The processes that they use to make PVC in the Uyghur region have been outlawed all over the world, including in China. The processes they use for lead acid battery recycling in the Uyghur region, been outlawed all over the world, including in China, but people are being given licenses to do it in the Uyghur region, and we can see lead levels in children's testing going through the roof for the lead acid battery. Mercury, the leaching, we don't know what the effects are yet, but we know what the processes produce. It's deadly. The people and the environment are being treated as disposable, and it's the hallmark of colonialism. It's the hallmark of forced labor, and it's happening in all of these different industries. I'm looking to see, marigolds, just all kinds of things, polysilicon for solar panels. And the research team that I worked with before I went to government did research on all these different magnesium alloys, all kinds of things, car parts. We did research on all these different industries and would publish that information. But one of the problems is, how do you respond? How do we deal with a problem that's so intractable? And I think the question requires us to take a step back and ask, why is this happening? A lot of people argue that, this is happening because of the Belt and Road. The Belt and Road Initiative is a Chinese government initiative to expand their supply chains, their dominance in production around the world, and to connect the world to China. I've never defined Belt and Road. I'm sure you all have a better way to define the Belt and Road Initiative, but this is my shorthand. And a lot of people say, this is to facilitate the Belt and Road Initiative. I submit to you that we can facilitate trade without using forced labor, right? That the Chinese government could have created incentives to encourage Uyghur people to want to work in factories. There could have been programs to encourage entrepreneurship. There were carrots they could have dangled to get people to engage in Belt and Road work, right? But there's got to be something else that makes it so that forced labor is the route we go. And part of that has to do with the Chinese government's anxiety about East Turkestan as an idea, about the idea of independence, the anxiety about maintaining control. That region borders, as Lala said in her TED Talk here. I hope you all have watched it. If you haven't, you should. As she said, now what did you say? What?
It borders 9.
Right, but I was like, where did my thought come from? Why was I pointing to you? It borders 9 countries, all the stands, India, Pakistan. So this is a route to Europe. It's a route to Russia for getting goods out. Sure, yes. But again, this is about maintaining control. It's not about being able to control the trains. They can control the trains. They can move things through that region anytime they want. It's about control of the people. It's about a virulent racism that pervades China. The further you get away from the Uyghur region, the more racist people are about Uyghurs. And this is, again, a hallmark of colonialism. But people have, I'm not even going to repeat the kinds of tropes that people truck in about the Uyghur people, but they'll be very familiar to you because they are classic colonialist tropes and racist tropes. And there's a sense in terms of work that Uyghur people are not willing to work, that they're conditioned by their religion to be lazy and to be looking for, glory in the afterlife rather than in this life. And so they're welcoming poverty. They embrace poverty because that's going to make them more likely to be pious and to ascend in their religion. And this is, of course, ridiculous. Uyghur people are, farming. Like a lot of folks are farming. When they're off season, they're like digging salt out of the ground and working, right? People, just like people everywhere in the world. And so this is a racist, a system that is grounded in racism, ideology, anxiety, but also a labor shortage. There's a labor shortage around China. People are demanding higher wages. And we have compared the cost or the wages of people who are being given the same job in the Uyghur region and a job in Jiangsu, for instance, and the wages are a quarter. And when we talk about forced labor, it doesn't necessarily mean people are being unpaid, but also a lot of times when they are being paid, they're being docked. So let me say that again. The definition of forced labor does not require that the people who are being forced to work are unpaid. That's how we often think about it. But if somebody cannot walk away from their job, it doesn't matter how much they're being paid, that's forced labor, right? In this case, some people are being paid, but we're also learning that their wages are being docked, they're being charged to be, bussed to a job that they don't even want to have. So there's also, some sort of, exaggeration of how much anybody's getting paid there. But they're getting paid. When they are getting paid, the cost for labor is much lower. The government is subsidizing the cost for labor. The government is subsidizing the cost for training in order to allow companies to move out to that region and undermine the cost of labor in other parts of China. They're also moving factories to Vietnam, which also undermines the cost of labor or undercuts the cost of labor in the rest of China. So this is bad for workers across China in general, not just for the Uyghur people, right? And so when we think about what can we do to address this, there have been attempts to address this crisis and the ideological racism that underpin it at the UN, right? By using human rights mechanisms, by trying to pull those kinds of levers, by trying to reason on the grounds of human rights. And I support that continued work. But it doesn't seem to be gaining a lot of traction. It doesn't seem to be changing the calculus on the part of the PRC government. But what we can affect is the economic lever. What we can pull is that economic lever. We can stop buying the products made in that region. We can, and if that doesn't solve the problem for the Uyghur people, and I'll submit later that there are some changes that we see that suggest that it is changing some things. It at least protects us from buying those things, right? Because I don't know about y'all, but I trace supply chains for a living, but I cannot tell you where this thing came from. It would take me years to even get to uncover some bits of it, and I still probably wouldn't know where it came from. I can't figure out where the cover to my phone comes from. I can't figure out where the charging cable comes from. And most of us, even the people who make the phones, don't know where the lithium and the copper and that kind of stuff comes from. And it's systematically hidden from us. So consumers rely on the government to do as best as we can to stop those things from coming here so that you don't have to buy it. And the US is unique in that we've had a law since 1930 banning the products made with forced labor from entering into the United States. We haven't used that law well until 2016, but since 2016, there's been increasing efforts to raise the cost of producing goods made with forced labor by not allowing those products into the United States and to protect our consumers from unwittingly buying them. So how does this happen? Is this thing, it sounds like it's making like, or is that people up above? Is the sound okay? Okay. It's not me. Okay. So how does this happen? I may be biased. I am biased, but I think research really matters. I think that, and I know that, a lot of people who were trying to advocate on behalf of the Uyghur people were desperate for grounded, fact-based, evidence-based, footnoted, footnotes. So good. I love a footnote. Advocacy can't happen without footnotes. And I was talking to actually a corporate representative a couple days ago who wants to eliminate some products that are made with Uyghur forced labor from his supply chain. And he said, oh, I was looking at this report, but there aren't footnotes in it. So I cannot figure out, I can't make the argument except to say, oh, it came out of that media piece. He wants to track it down. He wants to be able to make the argument clear. He wants to be able to go to his executive offices and say, this really, we have to change it, and here's why. I can show you. So footnotes, what we do matters. And so the research grounds a whole bunch of, I'm going to talk about how the research works. The research grounds a whole lot of different kinds of initiatives, different kinds of work that collaborate to make change. And this could be true of any kind of movement, any kind of advocacy you want to do. But the research is grounding advocacy, it's grounding strategic litigation, which is where law firms go after the companies that refuse to change or refuse to stop using forced labor or sourcing forced labor, make goods. Legislation, it fuels legislation. It's cited in the documents that people who are writing legislation use. It's also used to enforce the laws once they come into effect. So CBP is looking at media reports. CBP is Customs and Border Protection. They determine what comes across our borders. Sometimes that's people. In this case, it's goods. And they look to media, they look to academic reports to figure out what they're going to stop. Corporate initiatives, companies are trying to figure out who they can safely buy from if they want to be compliant or if they want to be ethical. And so they look to this research. And so the research we did relied on identifying cases of forced labor in the Uyghur region. This is what we were doing in Sheffield, Hallam, but that other organizations and academic units and journalists are doing as well. Then figuring out what can we say about what is happening in that factory, for instance. Who are their customers and suppliers, and who do those folks sell to down the line so that they get to the United States or to the EU? And there's all kinds of, there are all kinds of folks who are doing this kind of work. Media does excellent work. They can often use a lot of more resources to bring to bear. They can be on the ground, they can be talking to people, but a lot of the work is done using, at least in this field, using public information that's online, propagandas or articles that are written by state media about factories that are talking about the workers who have been transferred, in this case, a person who repeatedly said he wanted to go home but couldn't. And we use supply chain data, customs data. I've blurred this on purpose, but to create maps of supply chains to show you where things that are made in the Uyghur region are being shipped and to whom, right? And so there are tons of people doing this work, and then that feeds all these different efforts to, and look, and CBP, my office, I work for the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force in the Department of Homeland Security. We're doing this research ourselves. We don't take that information and just say, okay, well, done. That company is banned. We redo the information. We find more information. We gather intelligence from all our different resources and all our different agencies. And we designate companies that are not allowed to import into the United States because they are connected to or are actually themselves conducting forced labor, using forced labor. There are a million different examples of this. In terms of advocacy, there's a group called the Coalition to End Forced Labor in the Uyghur Region, and they've done a lot of advocacy, like just protesting and standing up and talking to legislators, but also talking to companies and trying to convince them how can they do better, what do they need to do to be compliant. There's the Coalition Against Forced Labor and Trade. This is a coalition of people all over the world, advocacy groups all over the world, that are petitioning their governments in their home countries to create an import ban on forced labor-made goods, because the U.S. has one. Through the USMCA, Canada and Mexico signed on to also have a forced labor import ban in the last couple years. Just a few months ago, the EU created a forced labor regulation that won't come into effect for another few years and doesn't exactly ban the import of forced labor made goods, but does create a situation where they can remove products from the market if they are considered to be made with forced labor. There are all these efforts going on, and including corporate efforts, organizations that are out there speaking about how using forced labor is undercutting their ability to conduct business, to keep their doors open. Tons of companies in Europe and the US are having to close because between forced labor, disregard for the environment, massive subsidies, the Chinese companies have been able to undercut the price of goods to the point where we don't have a diverse enough supply chain, and we're entirely reliant on sourcing from this area, or from China, and so we can't really get ourselves out of sourcing from Xinjiang. There's also lawsuits that are challenging governments to do better, to enforce their laws, to exclude Uyghur products from their, I'm getting towards the denouement here, from their countries. But then we also have to contend, this is the challenges. So government, advocacy, research, we're all working together to try to ensure that we're not buying goods made with forced labor and that we do everything we can to address forced labor in the Uyghur region by using our economic levers. But the Chinese government, the PRC government, has also created laws, oh yeah, you can still see the title up there, that make it illegal within China to comply with our laws. So there are two laws that came out in 2020 and 2021 that indicated that if a company in China were to comply with a discriminatory sanction, they then could be sanctioned by the Chinese government, and the consequences are intense. The consequences aren't like ours, an import by import, case-by-case analysis of your product and see whether it's made with forced labor. It includes deportation of you and your children, refusal for you to do business in China with anyone in China, seizure of all of your assets, what else do we have? Just inability to have visas. And so this is a mechanism which, until Thursday, had been used exclusively for weapons manufacturers, basically. Companies that didn't really do a whole lot of business in China anyway. They're largely, military suppliers. But for 2 years, 3 years, companies have been anxious because auditors won't audit in the Uyghur region anymore because it's reliable, credible auditors aren't really auditing in the Uyghur region anymore because you can't really do an audit there because you can't talk to Uyghurs in an unfettered, unmonitored, safe way. And investors are worried. There's all this anxiety. But on Thursday, the Chinese government announced that they were going to investigate a U.S. company for having complied with this law. And this puts us in a very interesting, with the UFLPA and excluding Uyghur region cotton. And this puts us in a really interesting bind that I haven't quite wrapped my head around. But essentially, there's the implication that there's this is a trade war and not a real, genuine attempt to, and we can debate this in the Q&A, but a real, genuine attempt to address a human rights crisis that is one of the worst human rights crises of our lifetimes. And that is what the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act does. It does address, and there are many reasons why people are motivated to pass such a law. But a primary motivator is addressing this genocide in the Uyghur region. And I think that it's easy for us to get sort of paralyzed by the intractability of something this big, by the power of China in the global market, by the power of cheap goods, right? The undercutting of the price of goods, the closure of all these factories. But I do think that there are some things that we have to be optimistic about, that there have been some changes that are due to the UFLPA and due to all the international pressure. And that is, we have seen changes. Even just the closing of some of the camps is a sign that the PRC government, the Xinjiang government, they recognize that they need to at least look different. that they need to put the legitimacy of the prison label on what's happening there for outside viewers so that they can go to the UN and say, look, we've done this. Or they can go to the ILO and say, oh, look, we've signed this convention. There's all this performance of legitimacy, and that is an effect. And one thing someone reminds me often, someone quite close to me reminds me often, is that we also don't know what we prevented. What worse thing could have happened that didn't happen, right? That we have to remember that this international pressure is critical because it could have been worse. But also, more and more countries are passing due diligence laws and forced labor regulations or considering them. And like I said, the EU has passed this law. It's going to take some time before it comes into effect, but it's a sea change. It is something that workers' rights advocates have been fighting for decades. And I don't know, some of you are folks from ILR, but I didn't have a whole lot of optimism that something like the mandatory due diligence would ever happen. And now here we are trying to figure out how to make it work. And that's a sea change. That's enormous. But we're also seeing expansion of production capacity in all kinds of fields across the globe. And this is important not just for addressing Uyghur human rights, but also for addressing worker rights in general, for making our supply chains more sustainable, for making it so that we're not in any kind of, to help us prevent the kinds of supply chain issues we had during COVID. So this supply chain diversification that the UFLPA has kind of compelled is valuable for many, many different reasons. We're also seeing development banks and governments invest more in expansion capacity or expansion of production capacity of a number of different sectors. Increased emphasis on innovation, which is important. If you have something that you can make like polysilicon for pennies, compared to what someone can make in Korea or in Europe or in the US, then people are not going to invest a ton in new technologies that cost a lot and may not work out. And we saw this in the solar industry, a real slowdown in innovation and funding in particular for innovation because polysilicon hit rock bottom and it was just so cheap to buy it that we could just keep producing panels and solar modules in the way we had been. But because of the need for diversified supply chains, because of the people pulling out of the Uyghur region, we see much more innovation investment and a growth in that arena that we had not previously seen. And we are seeing some companies say that they're ending their participation in labor transfers, and we're also seeing companies lose money, like declare that they've lost a ton because of customers that wanted to comply. And so there's the other thing here, but we're seeing also just much more emphasis on traceability, visibility, and transparency of supply chains that I think we ever could have imagined. And supply chains were growing ever more opaque, and now we're on a trend towards, I hope, more visibility, and more visibility for you, because platforms are starting to be developed where anyone can get on and see where things are coming from, and that technology is getting better and better, though also expensive at times, all the time. And so what I want to end with is just some sense that it's true that international pressure does work, that enforcement does matter, that this legislation has made change, and that we need much more of a global alignment on forced labor in general, which will help the Uyghur population, but will help workers worldwide.